Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, here today to finally get around to doing my comparison of some adaptations of the book of Little Women and the actual book of Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Now, it has recently been said since the 2019 adaptation by Greta Gerwig that every generation has its own Little Women movie, which is probably not very surprising because Little Women has been a mainstay of the American literary canon since it was originally published in two different volumes in 1868 and 1869, I believe. Both volumes were put together to form the Little Women that we know in 1880. If you are unfamiliar, the story of Little Women follows the March sisters as they come of age during the Civil War. The eldest, Meg, is sweet and maternal toward her younger siblings, but struggles with her own refined tastes and the diminished circumstances under which the family currently lives. They used to have money. They have since kind of lost it. The father is now, he's gone for most of the book. He has taken a position as a pastor in the Civil War. And Meg is the only one of the sisters who is old enough to remember their former circumstances and the money that they used to have compared to the situation in which they live now. The second eldest is a tomboy who is named Josephine but prefers to go by the name Joe. She loves her family dearly, but she really struggles with a short temper and a restless spirit. She also desperately wants to be a writer. And I'm not going to really get into a whole lot about the book, but she is also a stand-in for Louisa May Alcott herself, who wrote this book based on the experiences of her growing up with her sisters. And I like I said, I'm not going to go into a whole lot about the book itself or the writing of it. I'm going to include a link down below in the description box to a longer blog post that will cover some of that. So if you are interested, it will be there. Next is good-natured Beth, whose sweetness and docility often tip into being overly timid and shy. She struggles with that throughout the book and the movies. And then there is finally the youngest, who is Amy, who starts out a vain and self-possessed child, but ages into a successful and sharply intelligent young woman. Her character changes the most because she is the youngest when the book begins. Now, to keep things simple, I am really only going to be discussing two adaptations of Little Women. There have been 4 film adaptations in total. There have also been stage adaptations, TV adaptations. I'm definitely not covering those. But of the film adaptations, just to keep it simple, again, I thought it would be easiest to only cover the 1994 adaptation from Gillian Armstrong, which is largely considered to be the definitive adaptation of Little Women, and the most recent one, the 2019 version, written and directed by Greta Gerwig, which takes the boldest steps toward interpreting the material or reinterpreting the material. I should tell you right now, there are going to be spoilers if you are unfamiliar with the story. By and large, I think it's safe to assume that most people are familiar with the story of Little Women, but you never know. So just be warned. Now, I will be referring to some notes, so please bear with me on that. One thing that's common among all adaptations of Little Women is that the book itself is largely an ensemble piece. There isn't really one character who stands out, although Jo is sort of the through line, even though it's an ensemble. So any adaptation really takes Jo and makes her the central character. And it's easy enough to do that because, as I said, she is kind of a through line. She is the character who is the easiest link between the March household and their neighbors, the Lawrence household, where Mr. Lawrence and her good friend Laurie live. And she is also a through line to the home of Aunt March, who is another really important supporting character. So because of that, all of the adaptations tend to bring Jo to the forefront over her other sisters, which again makes sense because Jo is a stand-in for Louisa May Alcott herself. And in the same vein, focusing in on Jo allows the story to feel like it has more of a plot than the book does. The book is really structured in a very episodic way. Each chapter, or many of the chapters at least, feel like they are kind of moral lessons. And each chapter, it's like one of the March sisters is given a sort of conundrum or is forced to contend with what she considers to be her character flaw, which for Amy would be vanity, for Beth would be shyness, for Meg would be materialism, and for Jo would be her temper. and she learns a lesson by the end. That lesson is usually hammered in by their mother, Marmee. But because of that, the book is basically a series of episodes. Using Jo as a framework makes those episodes tie together into more of a plot. Now, getting into the movies, like I said, more than any adaptation, Gillian Armstrong's 1994 film is the one that best defines what people think of when they think about Little Women. It really embraces the moments that audiences enjoy the most about the story. For example, Amy, when she is younger, has this quest for a more delicate nose. And you really get into that in previous versions, but also in Little Women. You really get into Amy's righteous indignation about being punished by her school teacher in a humorous moment. You really get a lot about Marmee's essentially being the best and wisest mother ever. There's a lot about Beth's bottomless compassion, and Jo's fiery creativity and imagination is given a lot of room to play out in Gillian Armstrong's version. She writes plays that people act out, her family acts out. And there's a long scene with the Pickwick Society, which is the secret club that the March sisters have created for themselves, based obviously on Dickens and Dickens' characters. You see the Pickwick Society pop up in other adaptations, including Greta Gerwig's, but the emphasis seems to be more on how creative Jo is and how playful she is. Like its predecessors, Armstrong's Little Women is most heavily interested in the parts of its source material that relate to the youth of the March sisters. Obviously, it still goes into their young adult lives, but given the emphasis on the first half of the novel, I suppose I do have to mention that, like I said, there were 2 volumes that were published. Volume 1 more heavily deals with the adolescence and the late childhood years of the March sisters. Volume 2 goes into their young adulthood. Louisa May Alcott published it quickly because it was such a runaway success, Volume 1 that is, that people were demanding to know more about what happened next to the March sisters. So most volumes of Little Women lean more heavily on the first volume, but go into the second volume where a lot of key things obviously happen. Given that the 1994 film by Gillian Armstrong focuses on the first half and really emphasizes it, it can feel a touch earnest to me, if I'm being honest. An example of this is that in this film, the 1994 one, we're introduced to the March sisters by witnessing them make a decision to give away the breakfast that they have been eagerly anticipating to a needy family instead. In the novel, the sisters are prompted toward this generous act, and even though they agree to it, they are reluctant to agree to it, and even after they do, there's a little bit of hesitation until they get to where the needy family is and they see the result of their charity and they fully buy into what they have done. So the Armstrong movie opens with an example of the strong moral fiber of the March sisters, but the novel is introducing you to 4 lively and lovable girls who nevertheless are in need of moral instruction, as any young person is. And you see this playing out because they're prompted to do the right thing, they're at first reluctant to do it, and then they see why it was important to have done the right thing anyway. And that is, I think, the key difference between the book and the 1994 version. The 1994 version is enormously successful, but in this vein, I think it does also sand out some of the more complex aspects of the novel. Like, most significantly, Meg's struggles with married life are completely omitted from the 1994 version. It still has devastating moments. Obviously, Beth's death after a long illness is a seminal moment in the 1994 version, and it really heavily deals with Jo's difficulty becoming a serious writer. But it rather deliberately bypasses the subtle themes of the novel, which are that growing up to become a good person is hard work, and growing up is not always what you expect it to be. And sometimes when you grow up and get what you think what you want, it's not exactly what you thought, and you have to kind of continue to work all throughout your life to be a good person and to get what you aspire to. Now, outside of that thematic issue, several of the supporting characters are sanded down or sidelined completely for timing purposes in the 1994 movie. Mr. Lawrence, the March's neighbor, is largely absent, and his touching relationship with kindly Beth, who reminds him of a deceased daughter of his, is only really hinted at. Laurie is portrayed as a kindred spirit to Jo without any of the frequent allusions to or confusion regarding their different gender roles that you find in the book and in the 2019 version of it. Now, for most of the 1994 movie, Amy is played by Kirsten Dunst, who does a thoroughly excellent job capturing the young Amy in all of her childish vanity. Samantha Mathis takes over for Amy's older years, but for my money, this version never manages to have the older Amy make an impression as someone who has become older and wiser and perhaps surpasses her sisters in intelligence and practicality. I do think it actually makes her a little bit older and wiser. I think it's that part where she really is almost smarter and more practical than her sisters that is kind of missing from this adaptation. And that's unfortunately common in Little Women adaptations. When you simplify things for time, the full complexity of Amy is often lost, and the impression of her is that you're left with is really just of how she was when she was a child, which isn't necessarily fair. Similarly, Marmee is portrayed as a saintly figure here, which is certainly fitting. She's a great mother, very patient, very wise, but I confess I missed the most fascinating Marmee moment from the novel, which is depicted to great impact in Greta Gerwig's version, when she confesses to Jo, who struggles with her temper, that she is also angry just about every single day. To me, this reflects how we see our parents as perfect when we're young, but slowly learn to see them as actual people who have flaws and sometimes make mistakes. It really makes you think about Marmee more as well, who she is, what she sacrifices, and what she quietly endures day in and day out. You just don't get that in the 1994 adaptation. Now, I'm criticizing, but the 1994 adaptation is phenomenal. It's a great movie. It's just that since I'm comparing it to the book, I feel like I have to point a lot of these things out. And when you compare to the book, there are some areas where it is lacking. Taken on its own, it's a wonderful movie. I know for a fact that it is one of the favorite movies of Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse. He and I have talked about it. I know he is a huge fan of this movie and is less of a fan of the Greta Gerwig version. But, just take it, I want to be clear. It's a great movie, but since I'm comparing it to the book, I have to point these differences out, and maybe some areas where the book has something that is lacking in the movie. Moving into Greta Gerwig's movie, which is a kind of bold reimagining of it. Interestingly, I read the novel timed with the release of Greta Gerwig's movie, and I saw the movie when I was halfway through the book. So I was almost exactly at the break between Volume 1 and Volume 2. When I saw the movie, and I will never really know if my strong reaction to the second half of the book is 100% genuine, or if it was prompted by Gerwig's focus on that half of the book in her adaptation. Like I said, most adaptations of Little Women focus on the first half when they're younger. Greta Gerwig focuses on the part where they're older, and I'll get to that a little more. Leading up to the release of Gerwig's film, I read a lot of opinion pieces that questioned whether another film of Little Women was necessary at all in the first place, since we already had a couple of versions and what is considered a definitive version in 1994. It's just funny to me because I feel like prior success with an adaptation has never quelled the thirst for Shakespeare revivals, or, how many times have we seen the origin stories of Batman and Spider-Man by now, I know those are different situations, but it's just kind of funny to me that when it comes to something like Little Women, people kind of start being like, oh, that again? We don't need another one of those. But Gerwig herself seems to have really carefully considered that question as well. And that's probably a good reason why her version is the one that most boldly plays with the source material. Her film assumes that you are already familiar with the story and its most recognizable scenes. So if you're looking for comedy about Amy's quest for a delicate nose, you're not going to find it here. For eagle-eyed viewers, all you're going to get that relates to Amy and how much she wants a delicate nose is a glimpse of actress Florence Pugh pressing her nose down with a finger during a scene. It's sort of like an Easter egg for super fans, but it's not commented on. In fact, my husband had never seen a Little Woman movie and had never read the book before. So when we were talking about it later, I mentioned, it's funny, that's the only thing you see about Amy wanting a smaller nose, and he thought, oh, I assumed she had a cold or something like that. So you can see where Gerwig's version kind of depends on you being familiar with the story and has rewards for people who are. And if you're not, it can be a little distancing. The most drastic difference is that instead of a linear narrative, Gerwig focuses on the young adulthood of the March sisters. That's why there's a heavier emphasis on the second half of the book. So the childhood scenes come in the form of flashbacks. Now, this comes at the cost of some of those cherished childhood moments. As I mentioned, another one would be Amy's childish proclivity for malaprops, using the wrong words. It's erased entirely from this version. But the change in focus has really rich rewards that are missing from previous adaptations. Suddenly, we see the difficulties of adapting to adulthood playing out in really resonant ways. Meg finds out that marriage is work, and falling in love with a poor teacher was not the cure for her expensive tastes that she had kind of anticipated that it would be. She kind of assumed that she was going to get married and it would just be happily ever after, and that she would suddenly no longer want to keep up with the Joneses. And then she finds she still wants to keep up with the Joneses, and marriage is work, especially since in these times you didn't live with somebody before you got married. So suddenly she's confronted with her new husband's bad habits and realizes that she's not as ready to take on housework as she was. And to me, that's a really compelling part of the story that is missing from most adaptations because, it just kind of gets trimmed for time. Meanwhile, Amy has gone off to Paris with Aunt March, only to discover that although she's an able painter, she most likely lacks the superlative skills that would help her break into the male-dominated art world and be taken seriously, because again, she's a woman. So being good or even great is not really enough. She needs to be the best. And Jo similarly runs to New York to become a writer and finds that her dreams of success aren't just waiting for her when she gets there. Success may in fact come at the cost of compromising her goals. And then Sweet Beth, sickly and in declining health, becomes the force that drives them all home again, and which prompts all of the flashbacks to their quote-unquote happier childhood days. An unexpected delight from this is that changing Little Women to a story with flashbacks makes it a treatise about the shared memory and experiences that come with being part of a family. As someone who is on the cusp of middle age, I'm 37, I'll be 38 later this year, I find myself kind of reflecting on what I had initially expected my life to turn out to be and what the expectations I had had for the lives of my sisters as well. So maybe it's just like perfect timing for me to get that message, but it felt really resonant to me. I mean, it just like hit me in here, and I think that's part of why I love the second half of the book as well, but it's also why I really do love Greta Gerwig's adaptation, where somebody who's, say, a purist probably would not like it as much. I think Greta Gerwig found some beautiful new shades to add to the legacy of the story of Little Women. Now, this isn't to say that it's perfect. Oddly, there are no visual cues to tell you when there's a flashback and when you're in the present day sequences of the story. A lot of movies will use different filters or lighting to indicate a change in time, but if there are that kind of trick in Gerwig's movie, they're subtle enough that I didn't pick up on them. And because the actors all look and dress the same in both time periods, you don't even get cues from that. Amy does have a different hairstyle. She kind of has braids that are a little pulled back when she's supposed to be younger, and she trades it for a bun when she is older. But it's kind of subtle enough that you don't really notice it. It's not a good enough cue for where you are. I could keep up with this because I'm familiar with the story, but again, my husband, who was completely unfamiliar with the story, had a really hard time telling what was happening and when. And I have heard that complaint mentioned in other places and by other people who were unfamiliar with the story, that it's a little bit inaccessible if you're not already familiar. And I can see that being a legitimate concern. And I have to say, as great as Florence Pugh is in this role, she was nominated for an Oscar, it feels like a mistake to have her playing the character at both ages. When we watched Gillian Armstrong's Little Women after Greta Gerwig's, and when I told my husband that Kirsten Dunst, who was 12 years old at the time it was released, when I told her that that's how old Amy was supposed to be in the earlier sequences, he was just flabbergasted, like could not believe it. And again, as good as she is, it feels like, because it's like Peter Pan. You're always conscious of the fact that you're watching a grown woman play a young child boy. As good as Florence Pugh is, it's not Amy as she's supposed to be. Now, this Little Women from Greta Gerwig has the opposite problem from previous adaptations. While they focused on the March Girls in their late childhood and adolescence, they were forced to streamline the adulthood of the March Girls to the point of simplicity. In focusing on the adulthood of the March Girls, this version makes their childhood overly simple. For instance, when Amy is punished by her schoolmaster, in Greta Gerwig's movie, Marmee immediately decides to have her removed from the school, and that's that. But in both the novel and most previous adaptations, Marmee, who is ever a fair, balanced, and wise woman, has the sense to point out to Amy that the fault for this circumstance ultimately lies with Amy alone, and that she should have taken her schooling more seriously in the first place, and this never would have happened if she had. The moral of the story, which is what made it relevant in the first place, is gone from this version. Similarly, there's a section where Meg attends a ball in this movie, and she gives in to the frivolity of the other wealthier girls in attendance. Then Laurie shows up, and she begs him to let her have just one night of silly indulgence before returning to the real world and going home. It's a good scene in the new movie, but it misses a lot of the context of what was actually happening in that. In the novel, this scene happens because Meg finds herself humiliated by the company of the other girls. She has actually spent days with them. And she only had one nice dress. And the girls are making fun of her because she only has one nice dress. And it's not even fancy enough for this ball in the first place. So Meg feels humiliated. And then the girls decide to play dress up with her in a manner that really only thinly disguises how patronizing they're being to her. And that's made even worse when, at the ball, the women at the party are continuing to snicker at Meg. So Meg has found herself stuck. At once, she's in on the joke, but she's also humiliated, and she's simultaneously desperate to pretend that it's real, because this is how she actually wants to live her life, at least in this moment. So Laurie shaming her for what she's done is almost cruel, because it doesn't see the full complexity of the situation she found herself in. But in Gerwig's version, Laurie is just teaching Meg an important lesson about being who she is, and that's it. And that's fine. In the context of the movie, it works. But again, since we're comparing it to the adaptation, there's so much that's missing, and I really miss all of that additional context. And I think it's unfortunate because that is perhaps the sharpest social satire in all of Alcott's Little Women, and it's just not in Gerwig's version. And many fans of Little Women have been sad that Jo and Laurie don't end up together, but Alcott herself was always adamant that the two were great friends who were totally unsuited to romance with each other. Gerwig agrees and does great work to show this to the viewer, so it finally makes sense that Laurie actually ends up marrying Amy instead. In the novel, Jo's a girl who has adopted a male form of her name, while Laurie is a boy who has adopted a female form of his full name, which is Theodore Lawrence. Then they're kindred spirits burdened by the weight of their gender expectations. Most adaptations kind of skim over that, but it's there in the book, and it is really at play here. Jo is fiery and bold, but she's supposed to be docile and complacent. Laurie is tender, humorous, and artistically inclined, but he's supposed to be professional, ambitious, and disciplined. Gerwig understood the gender play and kind of allows it to play out, going so far as to conspire with the film's costume designer to make it look as though Jo and Laurie are trading objects from each other's wardrobe. Like, they're so close to each other that they even wear the same clothes, which is really subtle. I would never have known that if I hadn't read it from an interview, but it's so good. But Gerwig also shows us that Jo and Laurie are perhaps too similar for romance to work out for them. If married, they'd probably just co-sign each other's worst points, and then they'd end up in the financial ruin and never really getting anything done. Jo was just smart enough to see this and not be taken in by it, whereas Laurie kind of was. Instead, Laurie is really better suited to the practical woman with a low tolerance for bullshit that Amy grows up to be. He softens her, she hardens him, and it kind of works. And again, you only really get that because this has a much more fully fleshed out version of Amy than other adaptations have had in the past. And that kind of gets us to perhaps the biggest changes in addition, separated from the structure of Gerwig's Little Women, which is that she inserts a little bit of feminism and she changes the ending so it's a little bit more meta. She makes the March Sisters have bolder statements on feminism than you would find in the source material. A lot of people kind of have problems with that. I've seen it construed as, I know Jason was worried when he saw the trailer that it was going to be virtue signaling, and I have actually seen that complaint echoed since the movie came out, that some people feel like they wouldn't really be talking like that, which is fair. They wouldn't be making these statements in the time in which the book was published. But Louisa May Alcott herself was a feminist. She clearly manages to get a lot of feminist messaging in here in a very subtle way. So I think it's safe to assume that the characters would be feeling the things that they're expressing, they just couldn't say them. So I don't think it's actually that bad that Gerwig gives them an outlet to say these things. I also think it's important for a modern audience to understand the stakes in certain ways. So having Amy lay it out for Laurie that if she marries someone, she essentially becomes their property, makes sense because it's letting people know why it's such a big concern. Meanwhile, Jo's struggle as a writer is that publishers and audience will only accept her if she writes about romance and love and family. So why shouldn't she express frustration that she's capable of more in the privacy of a conversation with her mother, who understands Jo better than anyone? So I see the complaint, but I think it actually fits with the subject material in the book in the first place. Perhaps the most significant and controversial decision was to make the ending meta as a commentary on Louisa May Alcott herself and what she originally intended for the character of Jo. She did not want Jo to be married. She didn't think it would make sense. Again, Jo is a stand-in for Louisa May Alcott, who never married in real life. So the story builds to the familiar conclusion in which Friedrich Baer, a friend from New York, visits the March house and offers Jo one last shot at romance. In both the novel and other adaptations, that romance is seen through to its happy conclusion. But here, scenes of Jo running after Friedrich Baer and her happily ever after are cut with scenes of Jo meeting with her publisher in New York to negotiate a deal to publish a novel she has just finished that is based on her life growing up with her sisters, Little Women. Ultimately, Jo gets a sweet deal for her book and gets to maintain her rights to the story in exchange for a happy ending in which her protagonist is married off. And thus, the character of Jo further blurs into the identity of Louisa May Alcott herself, and the new movie interrogates the notion that Jo had to be married off in the first place. Some people don't like this. I think it's actually smart. And again, if you're a fan of the book and you want to be a purist about it, that's not going to make you very happy. For me, I thought it was a fun spin. But let's get to the point. Which is best? No contest. I'm going with the book here. Given the time and the space to spread out, it remains the definitive version of Little Women. It manages to cover a full evolution from childhood to young adulthood that no movie could ever really hope to fit without being at least 5 hours long. It's also funny and sharply intelligent. It's no wonder to me that this has become an enduring classic. As for the movies, if you really don't want to read the book, go with Armstrong's 1994 version. It will be the best introduction to the story. If you've read the book or seen one of the other versions already, go with Gerwig's for a deeper cut that will also prompt you to think differently about this classic story. But I'd love to hear what you think. If you've read this book, if you've seen the movies, drop that in a comment down below. As always, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. My dog's going nuts, so I gotta go. Happy reading.